Welcome to Powered by Sleep, the show where science meets performance. Our show is hosted by Paul Muchowski, PhD, neuroscientist and founder of Defined Research. Each week, we talk with scientists, physicians, and creators about how sleep isn't just recovery, it's fuel for everything you do. Because when you define your nights, you transform your days.
All right, I'm so thrilled to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Dr. Thuan Dang. Dr. Dang is a pediatric neurologist who specializes in sleep medicine at the Shriners Children's Hospital in Chicago. She received her Bachelor's of Science and MPH, or Master's of Public Health degrees from the University of Michigan, and her medical degree from Michigan State University. She completed her residency at the University of Chicago and a fellowship in sleep medicine at Northwestern. She is board certified by the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and Sleep Medicine. I met Dr. Dang while attending a conference sponsored by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, where I was lucky enough to eventually convince her to join our medical advisory board for Defined Research, Defined Sleep. So before we get started on today's topic, I just like to learn more about the guests we interview. So first, I wanted to ask, what initially sparked your interest in medicine? And I would also like to know, more specifically, what drew you to choosing a path in pediatric sleep medicine?
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me on today's podcast. I really appreciate the opportunity to just kind of chat and, expand just knowledge about sleep medicine. But when you ask me about why I, entered medicine, it's so that I could teach. A lot of people think about doctors as healers, and we definitely can be. But really, ultimately, my goal in medicine and what really fueled my desire to enter medicine is both my parents were high school teachers in Vietnam. And so I grew up with education as a pillar, a very important pillar, and recognizing that in the field of medicine, I could be a lifelong educator. I could always teach my patients. I could always teach myself, and I could also teach the parents and the caretakers of all my patients. That's really what drew me into pediatrics, because one of my patients is not just my patient. It's going to be every caretaker, every grandparent, every mother, father, aunt, uncle, sibling, family friend, soccer coach. And so the beauty of practicing in pediatrics is that the impact I can have just doesn't always stay with my patient. It's going to resonate for their entire village. And so that's really why I entered the field of medicine, to be a lifelong learner, but also a lifelong teacher.
Wow, that's fantastic. So today's episode of Powered by Sleep is going to focus on daylight savings time. Daylight savings time is still a thing here in the United States, although it isn't present in 2/3 of the countries around the globe. Every year in March, we move our clocks forward 1 hour and bring longer evenings into our lives. We call this daylight savings time. Then in November, we move our clocks back 1 hour, returning to standard time. Daylight savings time, or DST, as I'm going to call it from now on, was first implemented in the U.S. During World War I as a means to conserve fuel, electricity, and maximize productive daylight hours. So in the United States, it's been around for just over 100 years, despite nearly all people, including most of us scientists, and I think many physicians as well, abhorring it. So why do scientists not like DST? Ultimately, this event wreaks havoc on our circadian rhythms and actually does a lot more damage to your sleep and life than you might realize. So Dr. Dang, first off, could you please explain sort of what circadian rhythms are, what role they play in sleep, how are they regulated?
Absolutely. So as a neurologist, one of the things that really fascinated me was the study of different structures of the brain and how it really regulates just how we function, how we breathe, how we really interpret the world. And so there is a specific area of the brain called a suprachiasmatic nucleus, so the SCN. It's on every board question when you take it for your neurology boards. And this specific area of the brain is a group of cells that acts as your internal clock. It's your internal biologic clock. And it really is kind of like it's truly a clock that helps regulate the function of your sleep-wake cycles. It helps regulate hormone release, your appetite, your body temperature. And so the SCN really is your kind of like pacemaker. It's your internal driver. Now, circadian rhythms interact with the SCN by interacting of your exposure to light and dark. And so the circadian rhythms were actually discovered back in earlier research days, where researchers actually had several adult subjects enter a cave. And they were given they had stocks of food, water, but they were in this cave for several weeks at a time without any exposure to sunlight. And the researchers actually studied how did their sleep and awake patterns become affected when they didn't have any light exposure. And that's kind of how the field of circadian rhythm started being researched, is that it was really discovered that when humans do not have light input, the suprachiasmatic nucleus goes really offline. It gets very dysregulated. It becomes really lost. And the individuals in this research kind of experiment started to really not be able to sleep or stay awake because they had no internal tracker, no internal clock, because they didn't actually have light and dark cues to guide their circadian rhythms. The average circadian rhythm is approximately about 24 hours. Some people have a little less, some people have a little more, but averaged out, it's about 24 hours. But overall, the suprachiasmatic nucleus powers your circadian rhythm. And the two together help regulate how you go to sleep, how you stay awake, how your hormones release, your appetite surges, and your body temperature. And so overall, that's really, it's called a rhythm because it's really the rhythm of your life and the rhythm of your sleep-wake cycle.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It makes me think about a sort of case study or case example of one of our customers who actually spent a lot of his life as an engineer on a nuclear submarine. So, and presumably he too never really saw natural daylight for months at a time, actually. And he would complain sort of vociferously about like how it just completely messed up everything in terms of circadian rhythm and sleep and so on. So I guess that's kind of a real world example of your cave experiment.
Yes, it is, definitely.
So with so much screen time, working jobs with odd hours, and a lack of sufficient amount of exercise among many Americans, seems that circadian rhythms are messed up even before we move our clocks back. So why do you think so many Americans in general have trouble regulating their circadian rhythms?
So as I, spoke about the suprachiasmatic nucleus and how really kind of one of the bigger drivers is light. So when we look at like sunlight or when we get natural sunlight, it actually hits certain cells in your retina, and that actually sends the signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus to help you regulate, what time in the day is your body, are your rhythms going to be needing to be activated or, waxing and waning. We live in a society now that our source of light is not just natural sunlight anymore. We live in a society that is pretty much filled with screens. You and I are on screens right now. I will tell you, I'm fully guilty of the moment I open my eyes. The first thing I reach for is my phone. And the last thing I do before I go to bed, my phone again. And I'm a big fan of Apple products. Not that I endorse them, I don't work for Apple, but they always give me my screen time amounts every week on each one of my devices. And I'm too ashamed to tell you what the numbers are, but they are definitely in the double digits. So we live in a society now that the natural light source of the sunlight has now been replaced by screens. And unfortunately, that's not going to go away. And so that to me is the biggest issue with regulating circadian rhythms, is that
Yeah.
we are artificially changing what we see as daylight time. Our bodies actually get these light signals. And so the average, from sunrise to sunset, from the days of when, our society were more farmers or industrial workers, we did have invention of electricity, things like that. However, now as a society, we have changed our duration of the actual daylight time. And that has really affected our circadian rhythms because there's still only 24 hours in the day. And our bodies still function on that 24-hour system. But we have extended daylight.
So essentially, we're sabotaging our own circadian rhythms just through our daily lives of mainly through these little things we hold in our hand all the time.
Not necessarily say sabotaging. I would say it's an evolution of how we have, decided to survive as a society. But yes, we have definitely transitioned and evolved from what our natural biologic processes have perceived as daylight time. And now we have complemented it with artificial light.
So yeah, Paul Muchowski back again. Sorry for the technical snafu. I'm here with Dr. Thuan Dang, and we're talking about sleep and daylight savings time. So we'll just get right back to it. So while it's obvious that daylight savings causes us to lose an hour's sleep, it's not really just that simple, right? That just losing an hour's sleep and everything's fine. I mean, it seems to me that there's many things that it can happen to your body when you wake up an hour, and your mind when you wake up an hour earlier than usual. So I was hoping you could sort of walk us through why daylight savings time has such a big impact on our sleep, especially as it relates to the different stages of sleep and, how all of this sort of can negatively impact our health and well-being.
Absolutely, Paul. So actually in October 2023, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine actually published an updated daylight savings time position statement. And the statement was endorsed by 20 medical, scientific, and civic organizations, specifically advocating that a change to permanent standard time is going to be best aligned with our human circadian biology and also have the potential to produce beneficial effects for public health and safety. So a lot of people ask, why is daylight savings time so bad for our sleep? And as you recall earlier, I had talked about how light and darkness are some of the most powerful timing cues for alertness and sleepiness in the human body. And so obviously we're more alert in the daytime when there's bright sunlight, and we're sleepier at night when there's darkness. I mean, that makes sense, and that follows our 24-hour light-dark cycle. And this is what, as I talked about earlier, our circadian rhythm. The 1 hour time shift during daylight savings time results in less exposure to light in the morning and greater exposure to light in the evening relative to our typical sleep and work schedule. And so as a result of this, we actually tend to go to bed and fall asleep later, and this leads to chronic sleep loss. So over time, daylight savings time actually results in the misalignment between our sleep-wake rhythm and the light-dark cycle. And so sometimes you'll hear to that referred to as social jet lag.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to say it sounds just like jet lag.
It is, but it's not the jet lag that we, think about when we're switching time zones, because a lot of times people will talk about, well, isn't daylight savings time just like jet lag? And they're actually quite different, because jet lag is a change in the time zone. It's as I talked about, a temporary mismatch between your body clock and the local clock time. And it's only temporary because the timing of the sunrise and the sunset in the new time zone that you've moved to is different from your old time zone. But the sun still rises and sets earlier or later than your previous location. So as long as you stay in that time zone, your body's going to be able to adjust to the local clock time.
Yeah.
During daylight savings time, the local clock time actually changes, but the timing of the sunrise and sunset remains the same. So that's why you're going to have not like a actual jet lag of moving time zones, but more the social jet lag of you actually changed time, but the sunset and the sunrise did not change at all.
Yeah, got it. So how long does it usually take for our bodies to adjust to daylight savings time? And sort of related question is, seems like everyone's circadian rhythms are a little different. So why do some people take a shorter or longer time to adapt to daylight savings time?
That's a really good question. So, as you alluded to, it varies for every individual, and for some individuals, it can just take a couple days, and others it can take weeks for their circadian rhythm, that internal body clock, to reset to the new shift in time. Because as you remember, the key drivers of our circadian rhythm are light and darkness. And so, individuals that are more at risk to take shorter or longer to adjust are usually individuals who are having actual changing circadian rhythms. I really think about, as a pediatric, sleep neurologist, one of my most rewarding patient populations to work with are actually the adolescents. Adolescents kind of get a bad rap for parents, caretakers, adults saying like, you're lazy, you guys sleep in. My best friend in high school would sleep until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I was always a morning bird, and so when I would come to her house, her mom would always say, well, she's still sleeping. But that's actually because the circadian rhythm for adolescents does shift later and later. And so most adolescents are actually just sleeping based on what their body is actually needing. And so adolescents are a pretty high risk population to have a much more difficult time adjusting to daylight savings time, because usually they go to bed pretty late.
Mhm.
And older adults can also take longer to adapt to the time change. So this actually results in, and I didn't really get a chance to talk about it, but there are some negative health and safety effects of daylight savings time. We've seen increased risk of heart attacks and stroke. There
Yeah.
are increased hospital admissions due to heart changes to the heart rhythm known as atrial fibrillation. There's an increase in emergency room visits, missed medical appointments, and traffic accidents actually increase in the first few days after the change from standard time to daylight savings time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just to go a little further on that, we realized when we looked at this more carefully that it's pretty astonishing. So, just some more crazy data out there. A study published in 2025 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that if we stayed on a permanent standard time, we would prevent, in the U.S. alone, the possibility of 300,000 cases of stroke per year and reduce obesity prevalence by 2.6 million people. So to me, it's like these numbers are ridiculous and staggering. And how can it be that our country allows daylight savings time to continue, given that these negative associations of DST and health? At least to me, it seems that it shouldn't be too hard to grasp that DST just isn't good for anyone, right? So I'm curious, why do we stick with it? Free field, feel free to, you know, politicize.
Well, I'm a creature of habit, and so it's really hard to, adjust something that's kind of been ongoing for so long. If you really think about it, the US has a history of having a permanent daylight savings time. Started, during World War II. Back then, the idea was to put in place so we could conserve fuel, keep things standard. And then, there was an energy crisis in the 1970s. And so permanent daylight savings time came back in the winter of 1973 to 1974. And once again, the idea was to conserve fuel. And nowadays it's like, well, why do we still do it? And to me, it's kind of like different sectors of the economy and kind of like who are the key stakeholders for entertainment groups, kind of like recreational sports, things that require being outdoors. Think about it. Driving ranges, my son's playing baseball starting in the spring. So I'm like, oh, well, we're going to have later baseball games because we're going to have more daylight hours. A lot of outdoor activities, a lot of industries that, their economic kind of
I see.
viability.
Yeah,
So you're going to have a lot of those groups lobby.
I
On the
see.
other
Yeah,
hand, there's other groups such as like the movie industry. They don't love daylight savings time. Nobody wants to go into a dark movie theater when you have more daylight, or supposedly the, conception that there's more daylight outside.
yeah,
So ultimately, it kind of comes down to which industry is going to be the most powerful in their lobbying efforts for daylight savings time. And personally, I think that's kind of why it's still here, because we've had some pretty strong lobbyists in
yeah,
the industries.
yeah. That makes a lot of sense. So, in our last episode, we focused on the architecture of sleep and the physiological importance for each sleep stage. And so I thought, well, let's sort of transition into positive things we can do. But one thing I wanted to touch on first was, um, when we think about this hour of sleep that we lose due to daylight savings time, one can imagine that it might actually impact more than just sleep overall, but actually particular sleep stages. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yep, definitely. So, the key kind of like sleep stages that I think about as a sleep neurologist are, and especially the wearables that a lot of individuals are wearing, Fitbit, Apple Watch, the, Whoop, Oura Rings. They're looking at particularly what a lot of consumers think about are like the deep sleep and REM sleep. So, kind of just to remind our listeners that, so deep sleep, what's the purpose of it? It's really for physical restoration, immune system strengthening, tissue muscle repair. When I read sleep studies, how do I define deep sleep? I actually look for slow delta waves. There are large waves that are showing that the brain is slowing down, and the brain is slowing down to 0.5 to less than 4 hertz, where when you're awake, you're actually running at about 8 to 12 hertz. So this is like a 25%. That's why they call it slow delta waves. And that's the hardest stage to wake up from. That's why it's called deep. It's kind of really, really hard to shake someone from it. Deep sleep, known as also like stage 3 sleep, non-REM, it's more prevalent in the first half of the night. And as a result, the physical changes that happen during it are growth hormones are released, blood flow increases to the muscles. That's why you're getting tissue and muscle repair. In contrast, REM sleep is rapid eye movement. And the purpose of REM sleep is memory consolidation, emotional processing, and learning. And compared to slow wave sleep that I'm looking on in a polysomnogram, the brainwave activity in REM sleep is high activity. It's what we call low frequency, like alpha. So it looks very similar to being awake, but you're not awake. And the timing of REM sleep is usually more frequent in the second half of the night. And what you'll see in physical changes is that you actually have muscle paralysis, known as atonia, so that we don't want people acting out their dreams in REM sleep. If you think about it from a kind of like evolutionary biologic standpoint, you didn't want to act out your dreams in your sleep because the predators would be able to find you, if you're out in the wild. So this is like the body's protective way of making sure that you could get that memory consolidation, emotional processing, learning during REM sleep, but also not put yourself at risk for being eaten by a predator. But those are like the 2 stages of sleep that are really important and are pretty much very much affected by daylight savings time.
Yeah. And so it sounds like the REM sleep in particular, given that it's occurring at the later stages or predominantly at later sleep stages of the night, is probably the thing that gets severely cut off, I would imagine.
It can be severely cut off. It can also be reduced, because if you think about it, daylight savings time reduces your duration of sleep. And so if you're not getting the same amount, you're
So you
going
could
to
miss a whole cycle, basically.
yeah, you can miss a whole cycle. You could get less. And so, yes, it definitely can affect it. I mean, I watch my dogs going through REM sleep. I find it adorable, but dogs are special. They actually don't have atonia. They move during
Yeah.
REM sleep. So
Yeah.
I'm like watching my dog, like her paws are moving, they're flickering. She looks like she's almost running. You can
Yeah.
see her rapid eye movements, and I'm just fascinated. She's whimpering, and I'm like, she must be chasing a squirrel in the dream.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's funny. So on a more positive note, in terms of daylight savings time, there actually are some things that we can do to help combat the negative effects of daylight savings. So I was hoping you could walk us through some sort of concrete actions that our listeners could take to make this adjustment as smooth as possible. Um, and basically, how do we fix the system so that we minimize the damage that we're getting from this?
Absolutely. I can't emphasize enough having a routine, a consistent routine of solid sleep, you know, on really like a daily to weekly basis for a continued duration of time. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine recommends at least 7 hours of sleep for adults, and for teens, as I had spoken about earlier, who are more risk for being affected by daylight savings time, a minimum of 8 hours of sleep per night before and after the time change. So making sure you're not going from like a sleep deprived state to a further sleep deprived state. You also want to gradually adjust your sleep and wake times. So we're coming up on the spring part of daylight savings change. So you want to shift your bedtime to about 15 to 20 minutes earlier each night for the nights leading up to the daylight savings time spring change. And then in the fall, you would shift it to 15 to 20 minutes later, because we're looking, once again, making sure we align as much as possible with the change in the light exposure that affects your circadian rhythm. You also, as I spoke about earlier, want to remember that circadian rhythms affect your meal times, your like hormones for food cravings, physical activity. So you'll want to adjust those daily routines so that the meal times and workouts, walking outside, your physical activity will match your new schedule prior to the time change. And my mom always made me go around the house and set all the clocks to the right time before the shift, so that you just wake up and it's already there. You're not
So
wondering.
you're tricking your mind.
Yeah,
Right?
you're just
I
prepping
didn't
your
get
mind
that.
for that
Could you try
change.
again?
And then overall, you also want to, use the light and darkness to help your body adjust. I am not a big fan of daylight savings time. I mean, I never have been, but in the springtime, it's so incredibly hard because my son always fights with me. Mom, it's still bright outside. I don't need to go to sleep. So we actually have blackout curtains in his room, and we close them. And I make sure that I try to, even though it is lighter outside, try to mimic that, dark environment so that his body gets the cue to still, keep within a fairly regular schedule. I also grew up in Michigan at the very edge of Eastern Standard Time. So I remember my summers of being at 10 o'clock outside and I could still see and play with my friends. And I'm pretty sure my parents weren't thrilled the fact that, their daughter was still like up wide awake at, 10 o'clock. But recognizing that you can control the environment with blackout curtains, helping to reduce like the amount of light exposure at night to help keep that rhythm and that clock as aligned as possible, it's really going to help make the transition a lot easier. And then
Great.
also with the change coming up, make sure you do get plenty of sleep on Sunday night after the change, because you're still going to adjust. You're going to know that you are depriving yourself of an hour of sleep. So you are going to feel the effect, at least for a couple of days, if not, a few weeks, depending on how quickly your body adjusts to their circadian rhythm change.
Great. Thank you very much. So as we approach the end of this episode, we'll now reflect on some key takeaways from lessons we learned during the episode. But before that, I would first like to give a big thank you to our special guest, Dr. Thuan Dang. We can learn so much about sleep from individuals like Dr. Dang, and we really can't wait to host her again on another episode, hopefully, to hear other areas of stimulating areas of her medical practice and research. Certainly, just a whole episode even on kids and sleep would be quite interesting, which I'm sure many listeners would like to hear. So just to review some key takeaways, daylight savings is a government policy that I'm pretty sure nobody likes, but it's there. And most importantly, it has potential negative impacts on your sleep and well-being that folks need to be aware of. But, ultimately, it's not quite time for full despair. As Dr. Dang shared with us, there's actually a number of concrete actions we can take to help at least partially combat the ill effects of daylight savings. So as she mentioned, shifting your sleep to earlier sleep times in 15-minute increments. You want to do it quite as soon as you can before daylight savings. So I think daylight savings is on March 8th this year. So each day start shifting your sleep time earlier, and then hopefully by the time the day comes, you're actually already at the new sleep schedule. Sounds simple, but it actually works better than anything else that, as far as I can tell. And it's relatively easy hack, right? Another take home is that people suggest front loading your light exposure. So as you mentioned, is that light's the biggest driver of our circadian clocks. So get outside right away if you can when you wake up. As they say, even 10 minutes of overcast morning light can be enough to advance your internal clock. This is really a very powerful circadian reset tool, and it's free. As you also mentioned, the blackout curtains, I like that. Light coming in early in the morning is a killer, and I hate it. And so the flip side of that is that you can do this at evenings. Like you said, in Michigan or certain parts of the country, it's still light really late, especially as we get into the summer. So find ways to make it dark in the room earlier, right? Dim your screens, lower your house lights, give your brain the signal that nighttime's approaching. And melatonin onset is actually suppressed by even moderate light exposure. So your phone qualifies, by the way. Another suggestion is protect the sleep windows. You mentioned the first 90 minutes of sleep is where a lot of deep sleep occurs. Alcohol, late meals, elevated room temperature all selectively can suppress deep sleep. So in the week around daylight savings, you should be especially disciplined about keeping your room cool, making sure you finish your meal early, skip that second glass of wine, and support your sleep architecture, not just duration. So this is where I have to make the disclosure. I created this company, definedsleep, really because I couldn't find any sleep supplements out there that specifically targeted sleep quality. And when I mean sleep quality, I mean those important sleep stages deep in REM sleep that contribute to restoration. If all that I could find is a bunch of supplements that basically do the same thing. They sedate and knock you out and make you feel groggy the next day when you wake up. So anyone who has tried these types of supplements realizes the same thing. While you do fall asleep, you don't actually wake up feeling refreshed. So in our clinical trial, our clinical trial with Defined Sleep actually showed that our product appears to increase deep in REM sleep in patients with severe insomnia. And that research was published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine, which is actually an official publication of something Thuan's involved as well, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. It's a big group of sleep doctors in the U.S. that promote sleep research. And so during circadian disruption, like daylight savings time, doing different activities, whether that's exercise earlier or what have you, that could help support your sleep architecture, I think is equally as important as simply making sure you get enough sleep. So we hope that this episode helped you understand the details of daylight savings time, how it impacts your sleep and health, and several concrete steps that you can take to combat its effects. We'll be back soon with a new episode with our guest, Dr. Nefi Stella. He's one of the world's leading experts on what are called endocannabinoids. So our body makes cannabinoids, that's the T's. We'll take a deep dive on that system and how that system impacts much of physiology and sleep. Have you ever even heard of the endocannabinoid system? Maybe not. So stay tuned. So thank you once again, Dr. Thuan Dang, and we'll see you guys sometime soon.
All right. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Powered by Sleep, brought to you by Defined Research. If today's conversation helped you rethink the power of rest, share the episode and subscribe wherever you listen. You can learn more at definedsleep.com and follow us at definedsleep for data, research, and updates from our studies. Until next time, rest smarter, live stronger.